Clash of the superpowers, could China and the US go to war? Chinese military significantly more aggressive. By James Lillywhite, producer. A war between superpowers would be devastating. The world hasn't experienced anything like it since the Second World War, and technological advances mean any fight between the great powers could escalate to widespread destruction, the likes of which we have never seen. For decades the United States and the USSR looked to be on the brink of direct war, but thankfully this never came to pass. Now, though, the rise of China has led many to fear conflict with the US is inevitable, with both countries competing economically, militarily, technologically, and for influence. So, is a US-China war possible? China has risen rapidly to become a superpower and is now close to being on an even footing with the US. Since 1978, when the country began to open up its economy in the wake of Chairman Mao's death, China's GDP has risen an average of roughly 10% every year. While this economic rise has stalled slightly in recent years, partly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, China remains on course to become the biggest economy in the world sometime in the next decade. The leadership in Beijing has been on a mission to use that growth to transform its military. It's widely thought that China is the world's second biggest spender on its military, behind the United States. But a lack of transparency over Beijing's finances makes that difficult to prove. The country is thought to be increasing its nuclear weapons stockpile, rolling out highly dangerous hypersonic missiles, and is already a world leader in cyber warfare. Historically, China has been a land power. But over the past decades it has created a modern navy from nothing. It now has more vessels than any other nation. These warships have been built to protect China's interests and project power beyond its waters. And President Xi Jinping has made no secret of his military ambitions. He wants China to have a world-class military and one that can be fighting and winning wars by 2049. Xi is the most powerful leader China has had in decades. In 2018 the country removed the two-term presidential limit, effectively meaning he could be in charge for life. He is at the center of government, overseeing all the big decisions. And all the signs are he wants to use his power and his country's growing economic and military might to compete with the United States. The US has the largest military, the biggest economy, and is arguably the most influential nation in the world. But China is catching up and challenging its status as number one. The countries have been rivals for decades, of course. But now they are on a more even footing. A major war is becoming a real possibility. So, how could one break out? Taiwan is probably the most likely place for any conflict to start. The small island off the southeast coast of China split from the mainland after the Communist Revolution in 1949. Taiwan is self-run and democratic, but is also of key strategic importance to the US and to China. Beijing believes Taiwan is rightfully part of its country, and leaders there have pledged to achieve reunification. For Washington, Taiwan is a key, democratic ally in the region. Recently, US President Joe Biden has reinforced America's commitment to the island, even saying they would be willing to defend it militarily. She hasn't ruled out military force to bring Taiwan into China, and this isn't just talk. In 2021, China started upping the number of military aircraft it sent into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, something many saw as a warning. And in August 2022, a trip by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the island sparked one of the biggest escalations in tensions for years. China significantly stepped up military drills around the island in response, leading to fears it could develop into full-scale war. The war games eventually wound down, but it was a clear example of how fragile the situation over Taiwan is. South China Sea China is more or less secure in its land borders. It has weaker neighbors and a vast army. At sea, it's different. It is surrounded by a necklace of democracies with powerful militaries, like Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And then around the South China Sea, there are a host of countries, all with their own claims and their own interests to defend. The South China Sea is vital to China. It is a net importer of energy and food, so control over the waterway could be a matter of survival. It needs to keep those routes open. The US regularly sends patrol ships through the sea, partly to offer support to its Southeast Asian allies, and also to check the growing Chinese sphere of influence. It is becoming a key area in the growing competition between the superpowers, and a region where many fear conflict could escalate. China's growth has not gone unnoticed, and its rivals have started teaming up. There is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, known as the Quad, an alliance between the US, Japan, India and Australia that was resurrected in 2017. Then the AUKUS Pact was signed at the end of 2021 between the US, UK and Australia to address issues in the South China Sea. China was particularly annoyed by this, calling it extremely irresponsible and obsolete Cold War mentality. Fierce competition, flashpoints heating up, and aggression over Taiwan has led many to fear the worst. But if this rivalry did turn into direct conflict, how would it play out? Tong Zhao, a senior fellow at think tank Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, spells out what it could realistically look like. I think China is very much preoccupied with military contingency across the Taiwan Strait. So much of the military buildup is taking place with that in mind, he said. At the same time, the Chinese goal is to ensure the US wouldn't interfere. Or if the US chooses to intervene, China can counter US intervention effectively. So China is also developing capabilities that would counter the US regional forces. China has missiles and airplanes that can strike US air bases in this region or oversea territory in Guam. And of course, if the war further escalates, which is a small possibility, China needs to be prepared for that. As a result, China is also developing long-range strike capabilities, including conventional and nuclear systems. So if we're talking about an all-out war, it is escalating all the way to an all-out nuclear exchange between the two major powers. Everything will be destroyed in that scenario. And in direct military confrontation, both sides resort to economic sanctions and political cards, and they will rally their own allied countries and friendly countries to support them at the UN and other international platforms. The world will be divided for sure. It's hard to imagine the boundary of that type of conflict. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the resulting structural stress makes a violent clash the rule, not the exception. Graham Allison, political scientist, coined the Thucydides trap theory. The Thucydides trap theory states that when a rising power threatens to overtake a ruling power, war always follows. Thucydides was a historian in ancient Greece, and was writing about the rise of Athens, and the fear that instilled in Sparta. If he was around today, he may well substitute Athens for China and Sparta for the United States. But, when it comes to war between nuclear states, nothing is inevitable. Neither side wants war. What we can be sure of is that the rivalry between China and the US will be the defining one of our time, whether it remains a Cold War or turns hot.